Good evening. Welcome to the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh's Christmas lecture, Christmas Past, Christmas Present. My name's Kevin O'Dell. I work here at the University of Glasgow in the School of Life Sciences. And it's my kind of pleasure to be with you this evening in these slightly strange circumstances. I'm sitting in a very empty Davidson lecture theatre. And what I'm going to go through in the next 20 minutes or so is why this is Santa's most difficult Christmas ever. Now, one of the main things we like to do at Christmas is visit our families. This is my family. And this dates from perhaps the period of time where Christmas, and particularly the role of Santa, was at its most difficult. This image of my family is from about 1940. That's my mother at the back there in the middle, probably strangling the guinea pig or whatever she's doing. And this was a period of time where it was very dangerous, obviously, at Christmas time. And once again, we're in a very strange situation. So how's Santa going to manage this? How is Santa going to cope with the very difficult circumstances that he finds himself in? So it's difficult for three reasons. One is the population growth. There are more people on Earth than there's ever been before, so more people for Santa to visit. The second is remembering the route. As there are more people, there's more children to visit and more places to visit. So remembering the route is much more complicated than one might have imagined in previous years. And of course, we've got this added danger of coronavirus. So we're going to go through how Santa knows how to address all of these. He's a pretty good scientist himself. He has a lot of experience of biology. So he's kind of researched into this, and we'll follow a lot of the things that he's understood as to the way that he can kind of address these three problems. So if there were a time machine here in Scotland, what would year one be like? One of the actually most interesting facts I found out in getting this talk together was there wasn't a year zero. We went straight from 1 BC to 1 AD, but I can't quite understand why that happened. So if we travel to year one, we know why we're celebrating Christmas. It's of this particular event with the birth of Jesus. But where were people living? When Santa had to do that first Christmas Eve trip, where were all the people in the world living? Well, our best understanding of where people were living is really from this map. People were living pretty much everywhere in the world that they do now, 2,000 years ago. So people originated in Africa. All of our ancestors were from Africa. And about 100,000 years ago, some of them started to leave and move through the Middle East, largely following the coast eastwards. And some of them managed to walk to Australia. People tended to live their whole lives. They were born and died pretty much in the area, in the same area. And but over time, people moved through different parts of the world. So it took humans about 40,000 years to reach Australia. They could walk there because sea levels were lower. And so the indigenous population of Australia probably arrived there about 60,000 years ago. People also managed to walk eastwards via the coast across what is now the Bering Sea into the Americas, and progressively walked down the American coast over many thousands of years, probably reaching the tip of South America about 13,000 years ago. And some other people went kind of northwest, if you like, having left Africa and ended up in Europe. So I think it's quite interesting that people arrived in Europe later than they arrived in Australia, people like us. Now, the problem for people in traveling around was it's only comparatively recently, the last 500 to 1,000 years, that people could travel vast distances, often by sea. And so the big landmass of New Zealand didn't have people there until the Maoris arrived around about the year 1300 AD. So in those first Christmases, Santa wouldn't have had to travel to New Zealand. So what do we know about human migration? Most of the original evidence came from archaeological finds of where people were and what they'd left behind, but we can also do this with DNA. I'm a geneticist, and this is a kind of area I'm interested in. So you're built, your DNA, your genetics comprises all the instructions that make you. And the easiest way to think about this is that the volumes and chapters about this book of you are the chromosomes. The instructions of how to make you are the genes. There's 20,000 of those. And the language that you write this in is DNA. So the instructions to make you in the genes is in this language, which we can call DNA. And DNA looks something like this. There are basically 4 letters of DNA called A, C, G, and T. And you get 3 billion letters. So think this is a book with 3 billion letters in it, which comprises 20,000 instructions. You get a full set of this from your mum and a full set of this from your dad, which is obviously why you look a bit like them. Now, importantly, every time they make you, one of the great gifts they gave you was 100 new mistakes, 100 new mutations in your DNA, changes in this sequence. And that's what we can follow through. Imagine if you had a book and every time you printed it, you changed 100 letters at random. And then you printed it again, you changed another 100 letters and another 100 letters and another 100 letters. With a really clever computer, you could get all of these books together and work out who was descended from who, which book came from which other book, because of the way the mistakes, the pattern of the mistakes. And that's what we can do with people. And that supports that idea of people moving around the world in the same way, as I described earlier, through the archaeological evidence. What I think is quite interesting, and what Santa thinks is quite interesting, is that in 2020, there's about 300,000 chimps in the world and something approaching 8 billion humans. But at a DNA level, humans are much more similar than chimps are. So we might think that different groups of people, people with different ethnicities, are really different from each other. But actually, at a DNA level, they're not. We are really similar. And the reason for that, as Santa knows very well, is this sudden increase in the world's population. There's been a spectacular increase in the world's population since year one. And this is mapped on here. I think this is quite a scary graph. This takes us from year one to year 2000. Year 2000, there was about 6.2 billion people. And so what's the problem for Santa is trying to cope with this vast increase in numbers of people that he visits on Christmas Eve. I should stress that it's quite scary for me to think that since I was born, the world's population has doubled, but I'm not significantly responsible for that. So how many people does Santa have to visit? Well, the population of the world in year one is estimated at somewhere around 188 million. That's 30 times the current population of Scotland. And in 2020, it's around 7.8 billion, which is about 1,300 times the population of Scotland. So that's a quite amazing increase. The added problem for Santa this year is, of course, coronavirus, because not only from the danger of the virus itself, but of the fact that we can't do our shopping. So we're going to rely on Santa more than ever. This is Buchanan Street in Glasgow, the last day of shopping in Glasgow before the Tier 4 restrictions came in. And so people aren't able to go out shopping. So we really need Santa to do his job really well this year. So Santa's got this problem with the size of the world's population, and he has to work out a route. Now, what we've discovered in our research over the last few weeks is that he uses Glasgow University Library to help him do this. And we were fortunate enough to be granted an interview with him earlier this month to find out what he actually does there. So let's have a little chat with Santa and see what he actually does there.
Hi, my name is Iris and I'm a neuroscience student here at the University of Glasgow, and I've been told that Santa is here in the map room at the University Library and is happy to talk to us. Hi Santa, it's lovely to see you. Thanks for letting me talk to you. You must be very busy.
You must be Iris. It's really nice to be interrupted. I've been studying these maps for hours.
I think the people watching this will be surprised that you're here at Glasgow University. Can you explain what you're doing here?
Well, yes, of course. Every year there are more and more children in the world and more houses to visit, so that every year the route gets more and more complicated. So it's important that I don't miss out any of these lovely children on Christmas Eve, and don't forget to visit their houses. So I come to University of Glasgow Library to study the maps and the routes. They really do have the very best collection of maps that I know. Now, of course, you're a neuroscience student, aren't you? Do you have any tips to help me and kind of remember this route?
Well, Santa, one thing that might be good to remember is that everything that you learn is stored in your brain through networks of neurons that are in communication with each other. And the more you use those networks, the stronger they're getting. So if you want to learn this map of Paris, just really study it over and over and over again, and you'll use those networks and strengthen them. So hopefully that will help.
So thanks very much there, Iris, for the work you did. It was quite an exciting event, really, getting the chance to meet Santa. I was doing most of the filming there. We were both really nervous before we went in. So the key thing there, as Iris said, was that you've got to plan and learn and remember the route. But Santa's been helped over the years by Mrs. Santa. She's often left out of these stories, but we thought it was important to mention that while Santa's a bit of an expert in the area of biology, Mrs. Santa is very knowledgeable for technology. She likes to develop lots of the state-of-the-art technology, and she's really been in charge of some of the route planning through many of the years. And we can kind of divide this into 5 stages over the last 2,000 years. Historians kind of recognize these 5 stages that they call Santa 1 to Santa 5 of how Santa has gone about with this huge support of Mrs. Santa to actually learn and remember the route. So in the beginning, the Santa 1 era is all about memory, just in the way that Iris described it there, that Santa would practice, he would rehearse the route and try and understand the way he was going. And he had to do it all by memory. In the Santa 2 era, Mrs. Santa would help prepare maps, primitive maps as we would think of them now, on parchments, and Santa could take them with him on the sleigh. This was a bit problematic. I mean, it helped enormously, but the parchments are very fragile. They would often blow away because the sleigh has to travel pretty quickly, as I'm sure you can imagine. And so whilst that was very useful and a great development and a great support from Mrs. Santa, Santa still had to remember the route. The kind of Santa 3 era was when Mrs. Santa, along with Caxton and others, developed books, invented books really in the art of printing, and maps could be printed in atlases, so big books and so on. These were pretty accurate, remarkable progress. Again, it helped Santa with his route as it became more complicated, as more people were being born in the world. And that was a great plus, but the books were really heavy, the atlases were really heavy. And so there was only a limited number they could take on the sleigh, and they could often get a bit wet if it snowed and so on, and kind of fall apart. So again, it was still important that Santa remembered much about the route as much about the route as he could. In the Santa 4 era was when these primitive computers came in, and Mrs. Santa would help develop them. She was at the forefront of computing technology when these came out. Again, you can now store much more information in a smaller space, but again, these don't really like being in cold, damp sleighs traveling at hundreds of miles an hour. So whilst it was great progress, once again, it's very important that Santa remembers everything. Perhaps Mrs. Santa's greatest invention, and one she's not really been given the credit for, was the development of these little machines that can sit at the front of these little computerized machines that can actually design routes for you, the most efficient routes. These are known, well, Mrs. Santa called them the Santa 5 development. And they patented this, and it's made them quite a lot of money, which has supported Santa's Grotto and Santa's workshops and so on. But of course, they made a mistake when they originally posted the patent for these and got a couple of the letters the wrong way around. So you won't know them, refer to them as the Santa 5s, even if you've got one in your car. These are, of course, sat-navs as you understand it. But even so, despite all that, you still need to remember the route just in case they go wrong. Sometimes you get to places where the reception simply isn't very good. So Santa needs to learn and remember things. And this is something we can all learn from ourselves, in fact. You can train your brain pretty much in the way that Iris was suggesting there. This is a picture in the background is of brain neurons, nerves all kind of talking to each other. And you have all these nerve cells in your brain, which are represented here by the orange circles. And as you practice things, as you go through things repetitively for learning things, if it's like revision or whatever, these nerve cells start to make more and more connections with each other, which is what the white arrows represent. And so you can learn a route that way. You can probably close your eyes and think of the route that you will, when you walk to somewhere that you're very familiar with, you can probably see where the post box is and see where other things are. But this is what's happening in your brain all the time. So whether you're learning a route like Santa is, some dance moves, a song, some kind of sport or whatever, you're still, this is what's going on in your brain. And when you stop learning, when you stop practicing, these connections between the neurons start to break down. So practicing, learning, and putting the effort into that is clearly the way forward and what Santa does. So how can you help Santa this Christmas? He's doing a lot for us. How can we actually help him? Well, of course, one of the issues is that Santa is in 2 high-risk groups as far as coronavirus is concerned. He's 2,000 years old, so he's well over 70 years old, and he's pretty significantly overweight. I hope he's not offended by us saying that. So what could we do and what can he do? So Santa has this little motto, "'Tis the season to be jolly careful." And it's a very kind of sensible thing to follow. In fact, some politicians have nicked this idea as a phrase. And one of the things he encourages all of the elves and all the other people working in his workshop is to wash their hands. Santa understands that the science behind this is that if you wash your hands with soap, then basically the viruses will die. Viruses don't like detergents like soap. It kills them. So washing your hands on a fairly regular basis will help protect Santa and will help protect you and your family and friends. Santa's also aware of how you can catch it from other people without touching them. And that is to say, coughs and sneezes spread diseases. This is a pretty grotesque picture. I hope you're not offended by this. But it shows what happens if you sneeze and you spread little particles. And even just breathing, you spread little particles through the air to people that are close by. So wearing a mask is a very sensible thing, particularly in an enclosed area, and particularly with people you haven't met for a while. You don't necessarily need to do this in your house, but when you're meeting people that you haven't met for a while, or just randomly in the street or whatever, it's a good idea to spread a mask, particularly in confined areas. And Santa's very keen that we all understand that as well. We don't want to give Santa coronavirus. It would be very dangerous for him. And whilst there's no evidence that the reindeer pass coronavirus between each other or can get infected by it, it's important that Santa's very aware that he needs to make sure that everybody's conscious of the fact that they could pass this on, and encourages everybody at the workshop to wear masks appropriately. So here's a really nice image from an elf called Annie, the artist in residence at Santa's Grotto, of Clarice and Rudolph, with Clarice wearing a rather fetching mask there and Rudolph looking on very admirably indeed. So scattered amongst Santa's workshop and Santa's grotto, there are lots of signs up that he hopes the elves will follow. And he's really hoping that all the people he visits on Christmas Eve will have been following these rules as well. So he's got signs to encourage people to do a bit of social distancing. The further you are from somebody, the less likely you are to get infected. And obviously encouraging people in Santa's grotto, encouraging the elves, who, let's face it, can be a bit naughty at times, to wear a face mask as well. He also hopes in the new year that the elves will get vaccinated against coronavirus. He's looked at lots of data. Obviously, Santa, like everybody else, wants to make sure that it's safe, and he's pretty convinced, or very convinced by the evidence, that the coronavirus vaccines are safe. And when we look back in history, here's some data that Santa found on the internet to do with measles vaccines in the UK, and how that affected the rate of measles in the UK. So before 1968, when the measles vaccine was first introduced, about 400,000 people a year in the UK contracted measles. And of those, about 7% went on to have serious medical complications with this, that they might be hospitalized or might be seriously ill with this. It's something I think we've forgotten, because measles has pretty much disappeared, as you can see from this graph. By the 1990s, measles had pretty much disappeared entirely because of the vaccines being introduced in the UK in 1968. So Santa's very encouraged by this. He's going to make sure, or encourage, that the elves working in Santa's grotto and at Santa's workshop actually get vaccinated as well. And finally, Santa's motto through all this is that real science will save the day. He's not a big fan of these kind of pretend sciences and kind of laughs at them, as you can see there. So follow the science, understand what's going on, and we'll all be a lot safer and have a much better Christmas and a much better 2021. So Santa's hoping to save Christmas with science. He's very interested in population growth, the evidence coming from archaeology and DNA sequencing. He clearly has huge problems in managing the sheer population size of people on Christmas Eve. So he's learning from the science for that. He learns to remember the route, as Iris was explaining. He trains his brain, he practices, he rehearses, he revises to make sure that he understands the route, just in case the technology goes wrong. And then he's clear about taking all the precautions for coronavirus of social distancing and masks, and in the future plans to take the vaccine himself. So thank you very much for listening. Thanks to these people who helped out with preparing this presentation today. We'll be back in about 20-25 minutes if you have any questions about this, and otherwise enjoy our second talk. Thank you very much for listening.
So thank you there to Kevin and his real life interview with the actual Santa Claus. Our next speaker is Charlotte Holmes. She's doing a PhD at the University of Edinburgh, and she's particularly interested in recipe books and the fine line between medical recipes and culinary recipes. And she's got a few examples of particularly seasonal or Christmas time treatments for common complaints.
So I would first like to start off my talk with a disclaimer. My speciality is in the 17th and 18th century Scottish medical history. So while I will try to discuss this topic in a British way, it will inevitably lean Scottish. I will also be discussing this topic in my capacity as a Royal College of Physicians Edinburgh volunteer by focusing at first on the examples of recipe books in the collections, and then discussing the ways in which overindulgence was viewed in the early modern period, and what recipe books can tell us about how it was treated. So what were early modern 17th and 18th century manuscript recipe books like? During the early modern period, people kept household books of recipes that included food, medicine, cosmetic recipes, as well as more general household tasks, such as dyeing wool. So the dye itself would have been the recipe within the collections. These different genres of recipes were usually commingled with no clear delineation, which indicates that people didn't see these recipes as belonging to separate categories. Medicine was food, food was medicine, medicine was cosmetic. Because of the content, historians have understood these texts as domestic, specifically existing to help within the house and to help the household. It is perhaps not surprising, therefore, that many of these collections were written by women. We can also surmise that the women who collected these recipes would have had to be upper class, because they would have had to be able to both read and write, as well as have access to blank notebooks. In addition, these recipes were collected from various sources, such as social networks, newspapers, and printed texts. So I have two examples here of recipes that are attributed to other people besides the collector. So on the left-hand side, you see that she's attributed these two recipes to her mother. And then on the right-hand side, there are two different people that are attributed to the recipes. So the bottom one is to a Lady Floyer, and then the top one that you can see, a wash for pimples in the face, that's attributed to a Mrs. Howard, who is listed as the maid of honor to King William's queen. By attributing these recipe books, they sort of served a dual purpose. So they were saying exactly where they got these recipes, but also providing some sort of authenticity to the recipe. So in essence, saying this recipe works because this person gave it to me. So you can be rest assured, essentially, that this is going to be an effective remedy. Sometimes these recipes are hastily scrawled, and in other cases, they are carefully noted with ornate details in the margins. So you can sort of see from these attributions of the recipes to people that they're not itemized or anything. They look pretty slapdash. But then you get another example where the person has taken their time, has put ornate details in the margin, has written very specific titles, so it's written in a different font. So there's a very definite careful planning in regards to this one that you don't really see in the other one. The other interesting thing about this example is that it shows that sometimes recipe books didn't have one contributor. So in this example, all the way to the left, you can see that this has two very separate handwritings. So the top one is attributed to the collector, and then the bottom one is secretary hand, which is a specific type of font that people, or way of writing that people would use during this period. And it was most likely a man that wrote this, because I've never seen an instance of a woman using secretary hand. I also really like the example all the way to the right. There's a cherub and a cupid, and you kind of see this fairly often, different ways that people tried to personalize their recipe collections. And for me, this really does help to bring to the fore the personality of the collector. So the Royal College has two manuscript books. We've sort of already seen some bits of them before in its collections. One is attributed to Jane Taylor and one to Mary Sayer. So you can see Mary Sayer's inscription says Mary Sayer, December the 12th, 1717. So we can assume that she started this collection in December 12th, 1717. Jane Taylor is just simply written Jane Taylor, her book, with ornate details, because she seems to be the ornate person. Manuscript recipe books were often anonymous. So these examples in the collections are special because we can point to the collector of the recipes, although it is yet to be determined who these women were. Because while they provided their names, they have not indicated any biographical data. So, for example, where they lived, who they were married to, etc., or who their father was even. And it is difficult to determine in which part of the British Isles they were written. In my own research on Scottish recipe books, I have tried to determine Scottishness based on the language used and the measurements used in the recipe books. So the first indicator that a text is Scottish is, does it use any Scots words? Scots being the language people are most familiar with the Robert Burns' poems. So for example, does the recipe book or the recipe writer use braid instead of powdered? If not, if there are no Scots words, then the next determination is through Old Scottish measurements. So part of the Parliamentary Union of 1707 meant that Scotland and England were supposed to use the same measures, but some Scottish people continued to use Scottish measurements. One such example is the chopin, which is equivalent to an English quart in this period. And these sort of measurements were used up until the 19th century, so quite a while. Unfortunately, Mary and Jane's texts do not meet either of these criteria, so it is not at the moment possible to determine that these texts are Scottish. As stated before, manuscript recipe collections would sometimes obtain recipes from printed medicinal recipe texts. The Royal College has several examples of printed recipe books, but I think my favorite is John Moncrief's Poor Man's Physician, which you can see the title page on the right-hand side there. Originally printed in 1712 as Tipper Malloch's receipts, Moncrief's text represents a slew of medical texts meant to be used by those who were not in the medical profession, so the poor man. The text and Moncrief himself are shrouded in mystery. Not much is known about him or how he obtained these recipes, but for several years, this text was one of the most popular books of its kind in Scotland. And which is why I think it's really interesting. But also, we will be revisiting Moncrief's text a bit later on in this talk. Another such printed book was Taylor's Ruddy Doctor, written by Peter Taylor and printed in Scotland in the last quarter of the 18th century. You can see the title page here on the left-hand side. I mentioned this text because it is evidence that printed medical recipe books persisted into the end of the early modern period, and thus contemporaries did not see them as oddities, as we perhaps do, but rather useful texts, even as we get into the quote-unquote more modern age of the Enlightenment. So that's a little bit about recipe books as a source. Now let's move on to overeating and drunkenness in the early modern period and what these recipe books tell us, and what recipe books more generally tell us. So digestive issues were a common complaint in the early modern period, and perhaps this is unsurprising, as about 3/4 of the Scottish diet consisted of oats. Historian Anne Staubert argues that the evidence of digestive ailments in recipe books likely reflects the close link between food and health. And we can see this close connection in the medical theory of the time. For the 17th and into the 18th century, the medical theory was largely based on the teachings of Galen, which espoused the human body was composed of 4 humors: phlegm, blood, black bile, and yellow bile. Each person had a unique balance of these humors, and any sort of imbalance resulted in illness. So medications were based on rebalancing the humors, and one of the easiest ways of doing so was through purging, which is why you find many recipes for enemas and vomiters in these recipe collections. In Galenic medicine, diet and exercise were important aspects to maintaining health, to maintain the balance of the humors. And the need for a moderate diet was as far-reaching as to become a proverb. Eat in measure and defy the mediciner. To some extent, overeating in the early modern period has been overlooked by historians. Perhaps they have taken for granted that it was a simple issue of class, so only those who could afford to eat more and who did not have to exercise for work were the ones that could eat more calories than they expended. Michael Stolberg has tempered this idea by noting that cases of obesity occurred at all levels of society, so not just the upper classes. However, it is probably safe to say that there was more possibility for overeating in the upper classes. From the 17th century and increasingly after 1650, medical works devoted to the physiology and pathology of excessive fat and to causes and treatments of corpulence were printed. These works written for physicians would have been used for their clients, who at this period would have had to have been upper class people, because they would have been the ones that were able to afford the high physician's fees. Finally, the morality of overeating was ever in question during the early modern period. In a deeply religious Europe, gluttony was one of the worst of the deadly sins to commit. This piety was also met with a number of famines, making it increasingly difficult for people to justify eating more than their share. Scotland in particular was hit with a number of famines in the 17th century and a rather intense one in the 1690s. Therefore, any amount of excess fat was an outward sign of your devotional deficiencies. So while it was a marker of class, overeating also did carry this burden of morality. Now, in the context of early modern medicine, alcohol is a tricky topic. For one, alcohol is a key component to many medicinal recipes. For my own research, I surveyed 3 recipe books, noting their overt medical recipes and the ingredients therein. And in these 3 books, there were some 2,000 ingredients. And of these 2,000 ingredients, there were 163 instances of some form of alcohol. So wine, ale, etc. In addition, in a book about Orkney written in 1931 concerning the traditional healing methods, J.T. Leask wrote, quote, "One old man, known to the writer in his childhood, never tasted medicine of any kind whatsoever till he was 84 years of age, except whiskey, brandy, rum, or gin." This is not to imply that drunkenness was not an issue in the early modern period. The Protestant church would punish Sabbath breakers who were drinking during the time of sermon through the church's own forms of courts that would try moral crimes. So, for example, on the 24th of August, 1658, Patrick Tate, gardener to Lady Angus, was brought before the ecclesiastical court in Canongate because he had people drinking in his house the last Lord's Day in time of sermon, which he could not deny. He was subsequently given a warning that if this should happen again, or if he be found drunk himself, then he would have to give public repentance. Perhaps because of its fairly common occurrence, the recipe books do not have many recipes that specifically address drunkenness. But the famous proverb, hair of the dog, was in usage during this time. And in the 18th century, John Kelly collected what he believed to be Scottish proverbs, which he then tailored to an English audience. He wrote of a similar proverb, seek your salve when you get your sore, or where you get your sore, excuse me, which he explained was, quote, spoken to them who are sick after drink, alias, take the hair of the dog that bit you. So what can recipe books tell us about the treatment of overindulgence? The early modern term for overconsumption was surfeit. It was sort of used as a blanket. Surfeit was a blanket term for overeating and overindulging in alcohol. And if you'll allow me one more proverb, it was believed that surfeits slay more than swords. Many recipe books contain at least one recipe for surfeit water, which would have been drunk to alleviate the symptoms of overindulgence. In his recipe book begun in 1709, Archibald Campbell devoted 2 large pages to surfeit waters, to various surfeit waters, one of which he obtained from a Mrs. Mallet, which you can see right here on the screen. It combined poppy leaves with strong ale, which may have helped alleviate any feeling, let alone pains from eating and drinking too much. Similarly, in an anonymous 17th century recipe book, the writer included poppy flowers, a different strong alcohol, in this case aquavitae, which in Scotland at least was usually whiskey, as well as aniseed, caraway seeds, and coriander. These last 3 ingredients would have served to both heighten the medicinal benefits and improve the taste. In his Poor Man's Physician, John Moncrieff has several methods for curing surfeit that are all comparably easier than those recipes just discussed. This is perhaps because it is intended for a more popular, so non-professional audience. I have it here, what he says for drunkenness and surfeit. Coleworts were a type of cabbage, and here Moncrieff may be referring to the broth made from the plant, as it's supposed to be supped. And wormwood was often used as a digestive aid, even across Great Britain. The next instruction is, to modern sensibilities, perhaps rather odd. A vinegar-soaked cloth is to be placed around the nether regions. It is probably related to Galenic theory because vinegar was an astringent, or is an astringent, and it thus encourages the movement of fluids throughout the body. So this would have made sense to somebody who was reading this text. And the final instruction is the only one that specifies that it is for drinking. Truthfully, I do not understand why it is specifically almonds that are called for, but certainly eating before drinking is beneficial. Although I should say it probably should be more than 6 almonds. And then the other printed text mentioned, Taylor's Ready Doctor, is interesting in that it provides a preventative measure for overconsumption. Preventative medicine in general was underdeveloped during the 17th and 18th centuries, beyond tempering one's diet, as discussed previously. Taylor included a recipe for a greedy appetite, which suggests that the patient eats a pottage or porridge made from wheat and whale oil once a day for 3 days, or alternatively, to rub gum arabic on their stomach. Someone has annotated the text with the couplet, "For people that do largely eat, potatoes is the only meat," which I think is quite sweet. It appears that Taylor and the annotator suggested filling up on other dense food in order to stop oneself from consuming too much later on. Like Moncrieff, Taylor has several methods to combat the symptoms of overconsumption. One of his methods is particularly harsh on the body, but was probably in its own way beneficial. So you can see on the right-hand side his entire remedies for drunkenness. But I just want to draw attention to this one part. Quote, "And if the patient has drunk too much, let him drink about a mutchkin," which is another old Scottish measurement, which is, in this case, he's saying an English pint of said juice. "It will instantly cause him to throw up, and he will soon be whole. Otherwise, to make use of a good quantity of butter or fat meat before drinking," which he says preserves one wonderfully. So again, it probably was beneficial in its own way. To conclude, for the most part, history has understood the problems of overindulgence in food and alcohol as becoming a palpable hindrance to daily life during the Industrial Revolution, when people are expected to appear at a workhouse or factory at a specific time each day. And the first fad diet wasn't created until the 19th century from a pamphlet written by William Banting, which the Royal College of Physicians, Edinburgh, has in its collections. But clearly, through looking at the early modern recipe books, overindulgence was an issue even prior to this period. However, in my humble opinion, the holiday season is a period to enjoy oneself, especially this year. And in this spirit, I thought I'd leave you with a suitably holiday winter-esque recipe in Jane Taylor's collection, which is her recipe for gingerbread. And I think this is actually particularly interesting because each of these elements of the gingerbread could have very easily been transliterated, transmuted to medicinal recipes. So treacle or sugar would have been used in medicinal recipes because it helps the medicine go down. A quarter pound of the butter. So butter was used often in medical recipes to help the consistency of salves. Ginger and cloves were used very often along with cinnamon in medicinal recipes, both for their medicinal qualities, but also because they just tasted nice. And here brandy is used, and as we discussed, alcohol was used quite often. Brandy, not really so much, at least in the recipe books that I've looked at. More often you would see claret or other types of wine being used, but certainly brandy was used later into the 18th and 19th century. Thank you.